She was sitting on the kitchen floor when I got home, not crying loudly, not performing anything, just sitting with her back against the cabinet and her knees pulled up like she'd run out of somewhere better to be. I set my keys on the counter and I didn't say a word because I understood, the moment I saw her, that this was the night she was going to have to say out loud what she'd asked for and what it had actually meant once I'd given it to her. For months earlier, she'd sat at this same kitchen table and asked if I would consider an open marriage. Just to try it, she said. Just to see if it might wake something up. I said yes, because I loved her and because I was scared of what it meant if I said no. What I didn't understand, not yet, was that she wasn't the only one who was about to be woken up, and that the truth neither of us was ready for had nothing to do with anyone else. It had everything to do with us. My name doesn't matter much here. What matters is that I'd been married to Claire for 7 years, and for the last 2 of those years, we'd been doing something that couples do all the time and almost nobody names out loud until it's almost too late. We'd been managing the marriage instead of living inside it. Keeping things running, coordinating schedules, splitting the grocery list, being pleasant to each other the way you're pleasant to a colleague you actually like, but never quite see outside of work. The love was still there, I think. I believe that now. In a way, I wasn't able to believe it in the middle of it. But it had gotten very quiet. The kind of quiet that fills up a house slowly, over years, until one day you realize you can't remember the last time either of you laughed at something private, something only the two of you would even know to find funny. I teach high school history, which means I spend my days trying to convince 16-year-olds that the past is alive and has consequences. And then I come home and eat dinner with a woman I'd somehow stopped telling my stories to. Not because she wasn't interested. I don't actually know whether she was interested. I'd stopped offering long before I stopped caring whether she asked. That's the part that took me a long time to be honest about. Not what she did wrong, but how long I'd been quietly retreating before she ever said a word about opening the marriage. Somewhere around year 5, I'd started keeping the parts of myself that needed real air to breathe inside a smaller and smaller room that I mostly visited alone. Claire is a project manager at a tech company, precise and capable, and someone who solves problems by naming them clearly and building a plan. I fell in love with her because of exactly that directness, the way she could look at a complicated situation and find the through line without flinching. I loved that she never made me guess what she meant. Except, as it turned out, she had been guessing about me for years, and I had been guessing about her, and neither of us had thought to just say the guesses out loud where the other person could hear them. We didn't fight much, which sounds like a good thing and isn't always. Couples who don't fight are sometimes couples who've stopped having anything real enough to fight about. We had one medium argument every 6 weeks or so, the kind that resolves logistically without resolving anything underneath. And then we'd go back to the pleasant, careful management of a life that looked fine from every angle you could photograph it from. That was the marriage Claire proposed opening. That was the marriage I agreed to pry apart, not fully understanding what might fall out of the gap once we started. I think about the dinner party we went to the autumn before, a friend's birthday, 12 people around a table, and I watched myself from a slight distance. The way you sometimes can when you're not quite inside your own life. Laughing at the right moments, refilling Claire's glass before she asked, being a good and reliable presence in a way that had nothing uncomfortable or risky or real in it. We drove home that night, and I remember thinking, almost idly, that I couldn't remember the last time I'd said something at a table that surprised even myself. I filed that thought away under the category of things you notice and don't act on, which had become a fairly crowded filing cabinet by then. I never told Claire I'd thought it. That was the marriage. That accumulation of unmentioned noticings, quiet and colorless, each one small enough to ignore, all of them together describing a shape that neither of us had drawn on purpose. She brought it up on a Sunday morning in February, which I remember because it had snowed the night before and the light coming through the kitchen windows was the particular flat white you only get in winter, the kind that makes everything look like it's being held still. She'd made coffee. She was turning her mug in small circles on the table the way she does when she's already rehearsed what she wants to say and is just finding the right moment to say it. She told me she'd been reading about it. A book, some articles, a podcast a friend had recommended. She was careful to present it as research rather than desire, which was its own kind of telling. She'd framed it as an intellectual proposition because she was afraid of what it revealed about how she actually felt. She said she wasn't unhappy. She said she loved me. She said she'd been thinking about whether there was a version of our marriage that had more room in it, more air, more space for both of us too. And then she paused, and I watched her choosing between several different words before she landed on explore. She said explore, and I sat across from her in the flat winter light and felt three things at once, so tangled together I couldn't separate them for months afterward: fear, grief, and a small, shameful flicker of something that felt uncomfortably close to relief. The fear was obvious. The grief I understood, though it took longer. The grief was for the version of our marriage I'd been telling myself existed, the one where the quiet between us meant something peaceful rather than something avoided. The relief was the hardest one, because somewhere under the fear and the grief was this: I had also been running out of air inside the life we'd built together, and I hadn't once thought to say so. And here she was, saying so in the only language she could find for it, however imperfect, however alarming. And part of me was grateful that one of us had finally said something true. We talked for 3 hours. We set rules, the way you do when you're trying to make something new feel safer than it is. Honesty about what was happening. Nothing hidden. No one brought home. We shook hands on it like a business arrangement, which in hindsight was exactly the problem. We were trying to manage our way through something that couldn't be managed, only lived. I said yes with my whole voice and about half my heart, and I told myself the half I'd held back was caution, not ambivalence. I was wrong about that. It was both. She mentioned, during those 3 hours, one specific evening that I hadn't realized had stayed with her. A night 2 years earlier when we'd been at a concert, a band we'd both loved before we met. And during one song I'd closed my eyes and was somewhere else entirely for about 30 seconds. Just gone, just fully inside the music. She said she'd watched me and felt simultaneously happy for me and heartbroken in a way she couldn't explain, because it reminded her of what it looked like when something reached me, really reached me. And she'd been trying to remember the last time she'd been what reached me that way, and she couldn't place it. I had no answer for that. I didn't remember closing my eyes at that concert. I didn't remember the song. I'd forgotten the moment entirely, and she'd been carrying it for 2 years like a small wound she kept finding by accident. The first month was mostly just the awareness of it. The fact of the agreement hanging over everything like a change in atmospheric pressure that you feel before you can name. We were both, I think, too cautious and too proud to actually do anything with the new arrangement right away, which meant we spent most of February and early March simply knowing that we could, and feeling the weight of that knowledge inside every ordinary evening together. Dinner, television, the particular way she clicked off her bedside lamp. Nothing had changed and everything had. Claire was the first one to actually step into it, which didn't surprise me. She's always been braver than me about beginning things. She mentioned, one Thursday evening in March, that she'd been talking to someone she'd met at a work conference, a man named Dev who lived an hour away and had texted her a few times, and she wanted to tell me before anything happened rather than after. I appreciated the honesty and felt the floor tip slightly under me, the way it does when you understand intellectually that something is fine and feel, bodily, that it isn't quite. I told her I was glad she'd told me. I meant it, and I didn't mean it, both at once. We sat with it over wine, and neither of us said the rest of what we were thinking, which was becoming our signature move. The domestic texture of those early weeks was genuinely strange. We were, on the surface, the same as we'd always been. The same morning routines, the same Tuesday takeout habit, the same easy shorthand about whose turn it was to call the landlord. But underneath the surface, there was this new awareness, a kind of charged attention we were both paying to the space between us, like two people sitting in a room and both knowing a window has been opened somewhere in the house without either of them being the one who opened it. She started wearing perfume on some weeknights. I started taking longer routes home on Fridays, not going anywhere specific, just not ready to arrive. Neither of us mentioned these things. It was its own kind of not saying. I went out twice in those first weeks. Dinner with a woman I'd matched with on an app, polite and nice and entirely without spark, and one coffee that ended in 20 minutes because we both knew it immediately. What I noticed, both times, was that I wasn't looking for anything physical. I was sitting across from strangers trying to figure out if they'd ask me something real about my life, something that required an actual answer rather than a pleasant approximation of one. I'd spent so long in a house where the real version of my thoughts went largely uninvited that I'd started to mistake that for being introverted, for being someone who simply didn't need to be known. Going out twice in 2 weeks and discovering that what I actually wanted was a real conversation, not even anything more than that, told me something uncomfortable about what I'd been telling myself, about what I'd been letting pass for enough. Claire told me, one evening in early April when we were both in the kitchen making dinner in our usual parallel way, that she and Dev had had dinner twice, and she felt easy around him in a way she hadn't expected. I said that was good, and I meant it, and I also felt something complicated that I didn't quite have the language for. Not jealousy exactly, but a specific awareness of the gap between how she described feeling easy with someone new and how neither of us currently described feeling around each other. I kept chopping vegetables. She kept not saying anything else. This was us being careful with each other. This was also, I understand now, us being careful in entirely the wrong direction. I was looking, without knowing I was looking, for the kind of conversation I'd been missing for 2 years inside my own house. I didn't find it in February. I found it in April, at a dinner party at my colleague Marcus's apartment, sitting next to a woman named Mara who asked me, within 15 minutes of meeting me, what I thought history was actually for. Mara was a landscape architect who'd spent a decade working on ecological restoration projects, returning damaged land to something the land itself had wanted to be before people got in the way of it. She was funny and direct, and had the particular energy of someone who asks questions because she's actually curious about the answer, not because she's waiting for her turn to talk. When she asked me what I thought history was for, she wasn't making conversation. She wanted to know. And I realized, in the process of answering her, that I hadn't been asked a real question about my own life. Not what I did, but why, what I thought it meant, what I was actually trying to give those teenagers in my classroom every day, and longer than I could clearly remember. We talked for 4 hours. Marcus had to ask us twice to clear our wine glasses because he needed the table for dessert. We talked about her work restoring a wetland outside the city, and about a unit I'd been building around how ordinary people make decisions during extraordinary historical moments, and about a book she'd read that had changed something in how she thought about time, and about a documentary I'd been wanting to watch that she'd already seen and had complicated feelings about. I went home that night and lay awake in the dark next to Claire, who was already asleep, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not desire, not anything simple like that. I felt curious. Curious about another person, about where a conversation would go next, about what it would feel like to be seen by someone who had no existing picture of me to protect. Mara and I exchanged numbers before I left that night. I told Claire about it the next morning, per our agreement, matter of fact, having coffee. Claire asked a few questions: who she was, how we'd met, whether it was just talking. I said yes, honestly, just talking. Claire said okay and went back to her phone, and I couldn't read her face clearly enough to know what she was actually thinking, which was, again, becoming our signature condition. Over the next 3 weeks, Mara and I had coffee twice and a long walk through a park near her office once. We talked about everything except the obvious. I told her about the open marriage. She didn't ask about it much, We both seemed to understand that what was happening between us didn't quite fit the categories anyone had given us to put it in. What I was starting to feel wasn't just connection with her. It was grief and recognition. The specific, destabilizing grief of realizing you've been a much smaller version of yourself for a long time. And here's someone holding up a mirror and showing you the gap between who you are inside a room with her and who you've been walking around as in your own house for years. I'd been teaching my students all semester about a particular concept, the idea of the historical gap, the distance between who someone was and who the circumstances of their life allowed them to become. I'd been lecturing on it for 3 weeks. I hadn't, until Mara, thought to turn it toward myself. She didn't point this out to me. She didn't need to. She just kept asking real questions, and every real question was, in its own way, a small act of restoration. The kind of thing I spent my days trying to do for students who'd forgotten that their own curiosity was something worth trusting. I told Claire everything, because that was what we'd agreed to, and because I'm not built for keeping things hidden from someone I still fundamentally loved, even when the thing I was keeping would have been easier to carry quietly. I told her about the third conversation with Mara, the one at the park where we'd sat on a bench for 2 hours and talked until the light changed and I forgot what time it was. I told her that what was happening felt like something real to me, that Mara was someone I genuinely cared about spending time with, and that I wanted to be honest about that rather than describe it as something smaller just to protect us from what it actually meant. Claire went very still when I said it. Not angry, not immediately, just still, in the way she goes still when her mind is moving faster than her face, processing several things at once that she doesn't yet know how to rank. Then she said something I've thought about many times since. She said, I thought it would just be physical. For words that rearranged the entire architecture of what I'd understood the agreement to be. Not because they were cruel, but because of what they revealed, about what she'd been imagining when she proposed this, and about how much space existed between her imagining and what had actually happened. You didn't say that was a rule, I said carefully. We said honesty. We said no secrets. I know, she said. I know we didn't say that. I thought you knew what I meant. And there it was, the same sentence we'd been living inside for years without knowing it. I thought you knew what I meant. The assumption that a long marriage meant the other person could read the full version of every thought you'd failed to finish out loud. We'd built so much of our daily life on the shorthand of people who'd known each other a long time, and we'd confused that shorthand for genuine understanding. We understood each other's habits, our preferences, our approximate daily moods. We hadn't understood each other clearly in a very long time. The days between that conversation and her actual request were the most uncomfortable of the whole 4 months. We existed in the same house with the weight of what I'd said lying between us like something neither of us knew how to lift. I didn't press her to talk about it before she was ready. She didn't pretend nothing had happened. We were being, in our damaged and uncertain way, more honest with each other's emotional needs than we'd been in 2 years. We were at least leaving actual space for what the other person was carrying, rather than the managed politeness of before. I noticed this, with a kind of exhausted gratitude. I also noticed that noticing it didn't make any of the hard parts less hard. She asked me to stop seeing Mara. Not that night. A few days later, after she'd had time to feel all the way through what she was feeling and decide what she wanted to say. She asked quietly, without accusation, and I heard underneath the request the thing she wasn't quite saying. That she was scared, not just of Mara, but of what my connection with Mara had revealed about what was missing between us. I ended it with Mara. I want to be precise about why, because the reason matters to what comes next. I didn't end it because Claire asked me to, though she had. I ended it because continuing would have been a way of living in the solution to my marriage's problem instead of actually solving the problem, and I knew, once I sat with it honestly, that I didn't want to be the kind of person who takes that easier road when the harder one is the one that might actually work. I met Mara for coffee one last time, told her the truth of the situation plainly, and she received it with the same directness she'd brought to every conversation we'd had. She said she understood. She said she hoped Claire and I would figure it out. She said she hoped I'd remember that the person I'd been with her, curious, open, willing to say the real thing, was actually me and not some version I'd borrowed from the arrangement. I drove home from that coffee shop carrying her last sentence like a stone in my coat pocket. That night, Claire and I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd proposed this whole experiment in February, and had the first completely honest conversation we'd had in longer than either of us wanted to admit. Not a fight. Something worse than a fight. In the way that surgery is worse than a bruise, more disruptive, more necessary, with a better chance of actually healing something. She told me why she'd proposed it. Not the polished version she'd prepared, but the actual version. She said she'd felt the marriage going gray. Her word, gray, for almost 2 years, and she hadn't known how to name it without sounding like she was blaming me. And she hadn't wanted to blow up a perfectly good life on the basis of something she couldn't quite articulate. So she'd reach for the most dramatic reshaping she could think of, hoping to find the life inside the life, hoping to shake something loose without having to say what she was actually afraid of, which was that the two of them had stopped making each other feel real. I told her what I should have told her 3 years earlier, that I'd been disappearing, that I'd stopped bringing the best of myself into our home because I'd somehow decided, without ever making a conscious choice about it, that she wasn't interested in the parts of me that needed the most air to breathe, that I'd been living a slightly reduced version of my own life inside our marriage and had let that reduction become normal because it was easier than asking whether she actually wanted the full version. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was the kindest thing she'd done for me in years. When I finished, she said, "I wanted the full version. I always wanted the full version. I didn't know you'd put it somewhere else." We sat with that sentence for a long time. The kitchen felt different at midnight than it had at any of the earlier, more polished versions of that same table. More honest, heavier, capable of holding something real. I asked her whether she still wanted to be married to me, and she said she didn't know. Not because she wanted to hurt me, but because she was finally being honest, and honest was what she meant, and it was going to take time to build back from. I told her I understood. I told her I didn't know either, and that maybe not knowing and still being willing to sit in the kitchen at midnight together was the most honest version of love we'd managed in years. And she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in so long that I'd forgotten she had it. The look of someone actually surprised by what they've just heard, reached by something they weren't braced for. That look alone was worth all the difficult months that had led us to that table. It meant she was still there. It meant I was still there. The question was whether there would be enough left of both of us to build something real from this point forward. The weeks after that conversation were not a resolution. I need to say that clearly, because stories about marriages in crisis often jump to the turn too quickly, and what was true about our life in May was that we'd said true things to each other for the first time in years, and still had no idea what that meant for what came next. We were both raw in a way that made ordinary evenings feel strange, like we'd taken down a wall between two rooms, and were still getting used to the fact that the rooms were now one space, uncertain where to stand. We were careful with each other, which was good, and also slightly terrifying, because care that comes from not wanting to cause more damage feels different from care that comes from love, and we were still sorting out which kind we were operating from. I drove out to my brother's place on the coast one weekend, told Claire I needed 2 days to think, and she said she understood without any visible resentment, which told me something had shifted between us even if we couldn't name what yet. I walked on the beach for most of those 2 days, the specific kind of useless, meditative walking you do when you're not trying to arrive anywhere, just trying to let your brain run until it tires itself out. I thought about Mara, not with longing but with gratitude, for the reminder, for the mirror, for the confirmation that the man I'd been in those conversations was real and not imaginary. A version of me I hadn't lost, but had only mislaid somewhere inside the management of a life. I thought about Claire. Not the Claire of the last 2 years, but the one I'd married. The one who'd made me laugh harder than anyone I'd ever known in the first year. The one who'd driven 4 hours round trip in a single day when my father was in the hospital just to be in the room. I thought about a letter she'd written me on our second anniversary that I still had in my desk drawer somewhere. The handwriting she'd taken care with. The sentences that had made me feel, when I first read them, like someone had looked at me all the way through. I tried to remember the last time I'd let her look at me all the way through, and I couldn't place it. I found the letter on Sunday morning, in the bottom drawer of the desk I never use, underneath old tax documents and a photograph from our honeymoon. Second anniversary letter, in her handwriting, the careful, deliberate cursive she uses when she means something enough to slow down. She wrote about the person she saw when she looked at me then. Curious about everything. The kind of man who read 3 books at once and left them face down on every surface and wanted to talk about all of them simultaneously. She wrote that she hoped she would always get to be next to someone who made the world feel larger rather than smaller. I sat on the edge of the bed and read that letter twice. The way you read something from a person you thought you knew completely and suddenly see new. I thought about the man she was describing. I thought about when I'd last been in a room with her. What I understood, standing on that beach, was that I still loved her. That was not the question anymore. The question was whether love was enough to build a real marriage on, or just a reason not to walk away. The difference between those two things, I was learning, was where the actual work lived. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. I tell these stories because the ones that matter most are never the clean ones. They're the ones where people showed up for each other through the part that doesn't make sense from the outside. And this one was about to require something neither of us was naturally good at: asking for help. We found a therapist in June, a woman named Dr. Okafor who had a small office with terrible parking and an extremely reliable way of asking the question you'd been hoping nobody would ask. The first session felt like an intake interview at an uncomfortable clinic. Cautious, formal, everyone performing their most reasonable self. The second session, Dr. Okafor asked us each to describe the marriage we thought we'd been in for the last 2 years. Not the marriage we wanted or remembered, but the one we'd actually been living inside. Claire described a house with the lights on and nobody quite home in the rooms that mattered. I described a life that was right in every measurable way and hollow in the middle, like a costume I'd put on in good faith and slowly forgotten was a costume. Dr. Okafor listened to both descriptions without reacting, then asked us to describe the marriage we each actually wanted. We both went quiet for longer than felt comfortable. Not because we didn't have answers, because neither of us had been asked the question in so long that we'd stopped expecting it. By the third session, we were both crying over things we hadn't known were still tender. By the sixth, I said out loud, in that small office, something I'd never said to anyone. That I'd learned, somewhere in childhood, that the most interesting parts of me were the parts most likely to bore or inconvenience the people I most needed to impress. And I'd carried that lesson all the way into my marriage without ever questioning it. That I'd been bracing for Claire's disinterest for years before she'd ever given me a reason to. That I'd partly helped build the gray marriage she'd been trying to escape. Claire sat very still when I said that. Then she said the thing that broke something open between us in the best possible way. She said, I used to watch you in the first year, when you'd talk about something you loved, your classroom, a book, a trip you wanted to take, and your face would do this thing. Like a light coming on in a room that had been dark. I spent 2 years trying to figure out what I'd done to turn it off. I thought the open marriage might somehow turn it back on. I just didn't know how to say it that way. I looked at her across Dr. Okafor's neutral beige carpet, and I understood. She hadn't proposed the open marriage because she'd stopped loving me. She'd proposed it because she was grieving a version of me she missed and didn't know how to ask for back. That sentence rearranged me. Not because it let her off the hook, or me either, but because it made the truth finally legible. And legible was something we could actually work with. The open marriage lasted 4 months. What came after has been going on for almost a year now, and I don't have a clean name for it except the actual marriage, finally. The one we'd been circling around since year 5 without the vocabulary to enter it. We're still in therapy. We go every 2 weeks, sometimes every week when something surfaces that needs more than the two of us alone to hold. Dr. Okafor asked us recently what we thought the experiment had given us, and Claire said, evidence that we weren't as far gone as I thought. And I said, evidence that I was still in there. And Dr. Okafor made a note with her pen and didn't say anything for a moment, which is her way of letting something land before the next thing starts. I think about what Mara said when we ended things, that the person I'd been with her was actually me. I've been trying to bring that person home ever since. Not perfectly, not every day, but consistently enough that Claire can see the light I used to have, and I can see her seeing it. And something in that exchange is slowly teaching us how to be in a room together instead of just sharing one. She surprised me last month by asking about a unit I was building in class. Not a small talk, but with the actual curiosity she'd had when we first met, the kind where the question is a door she wants to walk through with me. I talked for 30 minutes. She didn't check her phone once. It was the most ordinary kind of evening, and it felt like the best kind of evidence. The truth she couldn't handle wasn't that I'd found someone else. It was that I'd found myself. And that finding implied I'd been lost in our marriage, which meant she was part of what had lost me, which meant we had more to answer for than either of us had been prepared to face. What I know now is that the truth doesn't end marriages. Avoided truth does. The truth, if you're lucky and you're brave and you find the right help, can sometimes be the thing that finally begins one. If this story found something real in you tonight, follow this channel. And if it moved you, send it to 5 people who might need to hear it too. Leave a comment below. Be honest, not polite. Tell me about the truth you've been afraid to bring into your own house. And tell me what story you want to hear next. I'll be here. I'll see you in the next one.